My daughter's voice still echoes in my head when she said those words, standing right there in my own kitchen doorway with her arms crossed. "You're becoming a burden, Mom." The coffee cup in my hand felt heavier than it should have, my fingers trembling, not from the stroke I'd had 3 months earlier, but from the sharp sting of family betrayal that cut deeper than any illness ever could. I'm 72 years old, and I thought I'd seen everything life could throw at me. Raised 3 kids on my own after their father passed when they were still in grade school. Worked 2 jobs to keep food on the table and clothes on their backs. Never asked for handouts, never complained when times got hard. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for the day my own children started treating me like I was disposable. The stroke had left me with a slight limp and some weakness in my left hand, but my mind was sharp as ever. I could still take care of myself, still managed my own bills, still kept my house clean. Yet somehow, in their eyes, I'd transformed from their mother into an inconvenience they needed to solve. It started small, the way these things always do. My son Michael stopped returning my calls as quickly. My daughter Sarah began making decisions about my medical appointments without asking me first. And my youngest, Jessica, well, she just stopped visiting altogether. They'd hold these hushed conversations in my hallway after doctor visits, talking about me like I wasn't even there, like the stroke had stolen my hearing along with some of my mobility. I'd catch fragments through the bedroom door: independent living facilities, financial responsibility, quality of care, cold clinical words that stripped away 30 years of sacrifice and unconditional love. The real shock came 6 weeks after my stroke, when I overheard them in my living room. The same living room where I'd read them bedtime stories and nursed their scraped knees. Sarah was going through my mail, something she'd started doing without permission, and she found the property tax bill for my house. This house I'd owned outright for 20 years. The house their father and I had bought with dreams of raising a family. She held up that bill like it was evidence in a trial. "This is too much for her to handle," she said to Michael. "We need to talk about selling." My heart stopped. They were planning to sell my home, to uproot me from the only place I'd ever felt truly safe, and they were doing it behind my back under the guise of concern. I stayed quiet that day, listening from my bedroom where I'd gone to rest. My hands shook, but this time it was anger, pure and simple. Elder respect seemed like such an old-fashioned concept in that moment, something from a different generation that my own children had forgotten. I'd given them everything, taught them right from wrong, supported every dream they'd ever had. And now, when I needed just a little patience, a little understanding while I recovered, they were treating me like a burden they needed to dispose of. But I wasn't going to let them write my story. Not yet. Not ever. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with my old address book, the one with the worn leather cover and pages yellowed with time. I started making calls. First to my sister Margaret, who lived 2 states away, but had always been my rock. Then to my old friend Dorothy, from the hospital volunteer program, where I'd worked for 15 years before retirement. I needed witnesses to what was happening, people who could see me as I really was, not as my children had decided I'd become. Margaret was furious when I told her everything. She'd always thought my kids were angels, had no idea they'd turned so cold. Dorothy suggested I document everything, keep records of their conversations, their decisions made without my consent. Hidden family secrets were surfacing, and I needed to protect myself. The next few weeks became a careful dance. I played along with their plans on the surface, nodded when they talked about touring senior facilities, smiled when they brought me brochures for places with names like Sunrise Manor and Golden Years Residence. But behind the scenes, I was gathering strength and evidence. I started physical therapy with renewed determination, pushing through the pain in my leg and the frustration of my weakened hand. Every small victory, every step without my cane, every button I could fasten on my own, was a quiet rebellion against their narrative that I was helpless. The physical recovery was just part of my plan, though. I also started paying closer attention to my finances, something I'd always managed myself, but had let Sarah take over temporarily after the stroke. That was my first mistake, trusting her with access to my accounts. One afternoon, while she thought I was napping, I logged into my online banking on my old desktop computer. My fingers moved slowly across the keyboard, that left hand still not quite cooperating, but I managed. What I found made my blood run cold. Sarah had been transferring money from my savings account into a joint account she'd opened in both our names, one I'd never authorized. Small amounts at first, $500 here, $1,000 there, but over the past month and a half, she'd moved nearly $40,000. My inheritance money, the life insurance payout from their father that I'd been carefully preserving for emergencies, and to leave something for my grandchildren. The family inheritance drama I'd seen play out in other families, the ones I judged and thought we were above, was happening in my own home, with my own daughter. I printed every statement, every transaction, my hands shaking so badly I could barely load the paper, but I got it done. Evidence, proof. I tucked those papers into a folder and hid it in the back of my closet, behind the box of old photo albums. I didn't confront her yet. Some instinct, maybe the same one that had gotten me through raising 3 kids alone, told me to wait to see how deep this betrayal went. The answer came 2 days later. Michael showed up with papers for me to sign, documents that would give him power of attorney over all my affairs, medical decisions, financial decisions, everything. He sat across from me at that same kitchen table where we'd shared 1,000 meals, and he smiled like this was perfectly normal, perfectly reasonable. "Just a precaution, Mom," he said, "in case something happens again." His voice was so calm, so patronizing, like I was a child who needed things explained in simple terms. I pretended to read through the documents, but my mind was racing. This was it, the moment they thought they'd take full control. If I signed these papers, I'd lose everything, my autonomy, my home, my savings, maybe even my dignity. But I needed them to think they were winning. So I did something I never thought I'd do. I lied to my own son. I told him I needed to have my lawyer friend look over the papers first, just to understand them better. He wasn't happy. I could see the frustration flash across his face, but he couldn't argue without revealing his true intentions. Little did I know that conversation would be the turning point. That night I called my nephew David, a lawyer who practiced in the city about an hour away. I hadn't seen him in years, but when I explained what was happening, he drove out the very next day. David was furious. "What they're doing is financial elder abuse," he said bluntly. "And if you signed that power of attorney without fully understanding it, they could drain every account you have and sell your house before you could stop them." Those words hit me like another stroke, but this time, the shock brought clarity instead of confusion. David helped me set up a plan. First, we changed all my passwords and removed Sarah from any joint access. Then we scheduled appointments with my doctor to get written statements about my mental capacity, proof that I was fully competent to make my own decisions, despite the physical limitations from the stroke. The doctor was shocked when I explained what my children were attempting. He'd met them during my hospital stay, thought they were devoted caregivers. He had no idea they were positioning themselves to take over my entire life, but that was only the beginning. The real shock came when I started digging into why they were so desperate for my money. Michael, it turned out, was in serious debt from a failed business venture he'd never told me about. He'd invested everything into some tech startup that collapsed, and he owed creditors over $100,000. Sarah's husband had gambling problems, debts she'd been hiding from the family for years. They were drowning financially, and they'd decided their elderly mother was their life raft. My illness had just given them the perfect excuse. Jessica, my youngest, the one who'd simply disappeared from my life, finally called after nearly 2 months of silence. Her voice on the phone was small, guilty. "Mom, I need to tell you something," she said. She'd overheard Michael and Sarah planning everything weeks before they started executing it. They'd told her to stay away, not to interfere, that they were handling things. Jessica had been too afraid to stand up to her older siblings, but the guilt had been eating her alive. She told me about secret meetings they'd had, conversations about selling my house and splitting the proceeds, plans to move me into the cheapest facility they could find. Family forgiveness felt like a distant concept as I listened to my youngest daughter confess her complicity through silence. The rage I felt was unlike anything I'd experienced in 7 decades of life. Not the hot, explosive anger of youth, but a cold, calculated fury that came from a lifetime of learning patience and strategy. They thought I was weak because I was old, because I'd had a stroke, because I'd trusted them with my vulnerability. They were about to learn exactly how wrong they were. I waited until Sunday dinner, a tradition I'd maintained every week for 30 years even when it was just me eating alone. This time, I made sure all three of them came. Told them I had something important to discuss about my living arrangements. They showed up with smiles, probably thinking I was finally going to surrender, sign their papers, make their lives easier. Michael brought wine. Sarah brought dessert. Jessica looked like she might vomit from nervousness. We sat down at my dining room table, the one with the scratched surface from years of homework sessions and family game nights. I served the pot roast I'd made, proving I could still cook a full meal despite their claims I couldn't care for myself. And then, after everyone had filled their plates, after they'd started to relax and chat about their weeks, I cleared my throat. "I have some documents I'd like you all to see," I said calmly, reaching under my chair for the folder I'd prepared. My voice didn't shake, my hands were steady, and I felt more powerful than I had in months. I laid out the bank statements first. Every transaction Sarah had made highlighted in yellow. The silence was immediate and absolute. Sarah's fork clattered against her plate. "I imagine you were hoping I wouldn't notice," I continued, looking directly at my daughter. $40,000 is a lot of money to steal from your own mother." Sarah's face went white, then red. She started to speak, some excuse forming on her lips. But I held up my hand. I wasn't done. Next, I showed them the power of attorney documents Michael had brought, now annotated by David with notes about what rights I would have been signing away. Everything I explained, my home, my money, my medical decisions, all of it would have gone to you. And based on what Jessica told me about your conversations, you weren't planning to use it in my best interest. Michael's jaw tightened and he glared at Jessica, who was crying quietly into her napkin. The confrontation I'd imagined would feel victorious just felt sad. These were my children, people I'd sacrificed everything for, and they'd been willing to betray me in my moment of weakness. But I wasn't going to let sadness stop me from protecting myself. I told them about the lawyer, about the doctor's assessments, about the new locks I'd installed on my doors, while they thought I was too weak to manage home repairs. I told them about the police report I'd filed regarding the unauthorized transfers, though I hadn't pressed charges yet. "You treated me like a burden because I had a stroke," I said, my voice finally showing some of the emotion I'd been containing. "Like 30 years of being your mother meant nothing compared to the inconvenience of my recovery. You saw an opportunity to solve your financial problems, and you decided I was acceptable collateral damage." The words hung in the air like smoke. Michael tried to defend himself, claiming they were just worried about me, but his words were hollow, and we all knew it. Sarah broke down completely, sobbing about her husband's debts and how desperate she'd been. I felt a flicker of sympathy, quickly extinguished by remembering she'd been stealing from me for weeks. Jessica apologized repeatedly, begging forgiveness for not speaking up sooner. I let them sit in their discomfort for a long moment before I delivered my final statement. "I'm not pressing charges," I said, though David advised me to. "Not because you deserve my mercy, but because I'm choosing not to let this destroy what's left of our family. However, there are conditions. Sarah would return every penny she'd taken, plus interest, through a payment plan David would oversee. Michael would have no access to my finances, medical information, or property decisions ever again. And Jessica, well, she'd have to earn back my trust through consistent presence and honesty." The house cleared quickly after that. No one had much appetite for pot roast anymore. I sat alone at my table, surrounded by the debris of dinner and destroyed relationships, and I felt something unexpected, relief. I'd stood up for myself, protected my autonomy, proven I wasn't the helpless burden they'd tried to make me believe I was. The weeks that followed were difficult, but liberating. Sarah made her first payment, though I could tell it hurt her pride to do it. Michael sent a brief email apologizing, though it felt more obligatory than genuine. Jessica started calling regularly, actually listening when I talked instead of just going through the motions of conversation. My physical therapy continued, and I regained more strength and mobility than even my doctor expected. Turns out, having something to fight for, a reason to prove everyone wrong, was better motivation than any medical treatment. My sister Margaret came to visit and stayed for a month, helping me establish new routines and boundaries. She witnessed the changes in my relationship with my kids, the careful distance I maintained, the way I'd learned to trust only so far. She told me I was handling everything with remarkable grace. But the truth was, grace had nothing to do with it. This was pure survival instinct, the same determination that had gotten me through widowhood and single parenthood and every other challenge life had thrown at me. The real transformation happened about 3 months after that confrontational dinner. My grandson Tyler, Sarah's oldest boy, came to visit. He was 16, old enough to understand what had happened, but young enough to still see me as his grandmother first and a financial asset never. We sat on my porch drinking lemonade, and he asked me directly how I'd known to fight back when everyone thought I was too weak. I told him the truth, that weakness and strength aren't opposites, that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is admit you need help, but only from people who actually care about helping rather than helping themselves. I told him about the difference between being vulnerable and being a victim, about how you teach people to treat you by what you tolerate. He listened with an intensity that reminded me of his mother at that age, before life had hardened her and made her desperate. Tyler asked if I hated his mother now. The question caught me off guard, made me really examine my feelings. I don't hate her, I said finally. I'm disappointed, I'm hurt. But hate takes too much energy, and I've learned that energy is precious at my age. What I feel is sadness for who she became when money got tight, and hope that maybe she'll learn from this mistake before it's too late for her own relationships. That conversation with Tyler shifted something in me. I realized I'd been so focused on protecting myself from my children's betrayal that I'd forgotten about the next generation. My grandchildren were watching all of this unfold, learning lessons about family loyalty and elder respect, whether I intended to teach them or not. So I started being more intentional about maintaining relationships with them, creating bonds that existed independent of their parents' failures. The house remained mine, of course. I still wake up in the same bedroom I've slept in for 30 years, still make coffee in the same kitchen where so much family drama has played out. But it feels different now, more mine than it ever did before. I'd been living here as a custodian of family memories, a caretaker of a space meant for gatherings and traditions. Now I lived here as its rightful owner, someone who'd fought to keep what was hers and won. Physical recovery continued its slow march forward. 6 months after the stroke, I could walk without a cane most days. My left hand still got tired easily, but I learned accommodations and modifications that let me maintain my independence. I started volunteering at the hospital again, just a few hours a week, helping other stroke survivors navigate their recoveries. Sharing my story became therapeutic, watching their faces change from despair to determination when they realized someone else had fought through similar challenges and come out stronger. One afternoon at the hospital, I met another woman my age who was recovering from a stroke. Her adult children were hovering constantly, making all her decisions, speaking for her even when she was perfectly capable of speaking for herself. I recognized that look in her eyes, that mixture of gratitude and resentment, appreciating the care, but resenting the loss of autonomy. I pulled her children aside and told them my story. Not all the details, but enough to make them understand that helping doesn't mean controlling. They listened politely, but I could tell they thought I was an anomaly, that their mother's situation was different. It probably was. Every family has its own dynamics, its own complications, but the core truth remained the same across all our stories. Getting older doesn't make you less worthy of respect. Having health problems doesn't surrender your right to make decisions about your own life. And family love, real love, supports rather than suffocates. As the 1-year anniversary of my stroke approached, I decided to host a family dinner again. Not because everything was healed or forgiven, but because I wanted to prove to myself that I could reclaim that tradition on my own terms. I invited all 3 of my children and made it clear attendance was optional, but I hoped they'd come. I also invited Margaret, David, Dorothy, and a few other friends who'd supported me through the hardest year of my life. Sarah came early to help cook, though I'd made it clear I didn't need help. She moved around my kitchen tentatively, asking permission before touching anything, a stark contrast to the entitled way she'd gone through my mail and my accounts a year ago. We didn't talk much, but there was understanding between us now, fragile but present. Michael arrived on time with a bouquet of flowers and a genuine apology, one that acknowledged specific wrongs rather than vague regrets. Jessica brought her family and helped set the table, chatting nervously about her kids' school activities and her new job. The dinner wasn't perfect. There were awkward silences and careful conversations that avoided landmines, but we got through it, and there was something powerful about gathering again in that same dining room where I'd confronted them, proving we could exist in the same space without destruction. My grandchildren laughed and played, oblivious to the complicated history that haunted the adults, and watching them reminded me why family was worth fighting for, even when family hurt you. After everyone left, I sat on my porch in the twilight, my old chair creaking under my weight, and reflected on everything that had changed in a year. The stroke had taken some things from me. There was no denying that. But it had also revealed truths I needed to see, forced me to develop strength I didn't know I still possessed, and taught me that being called a burden by your own children could either break you or remake you. I chose the remaking. The comeback they hadn't expected wasn't dramatic or explosive. It was quiet and persistent, the kind that comes from refusing to accept other people's definitions of who you are. They decided I was helpless, so I proved I could still manage my own life. They decided I was too old to understand finances, so I learned online banking and caught them stealing. They decided I was a problem to solve, so I became the solution instead. I thought about all the other elderly people out there facing similar situations, children who viewed aging parents as burdens rather than people deserving of dignity. How many of them signed away their rights because they trusted their families? How many lost their homes, their savings, their autonomy because they believed they were too weak to fight back? The thought made me angry and sad in equal measure. That's when I decided to start writing everything down, documenting what happened and how I'd fought back, not for publication or attention, but to leave behind for my grandchildren. I wanted them to know their grandmother's full story, not just the sanitized version their parents might tell. I wanted them to understand that getting older doesn't mean giving up, that illness is something you go through rather than something that defines you, and that family betrayal is survivable if you're willing to stand up for yourself. The writing became part of my healing process. Every morning I'd sit at my computer, that left hand still clumsy on the keyboard, but improving with practice, and I'd type out memories and reflections. The act of transforming pain into narrative gave me perspective, helped me see patterns and lessons I'd missed while living through the chaos. It also helped me process the complicated feelings I still carried about my children. Because here's the truth nobody wants to say out loud. You can love your children deeply and still be deeply disappointed by them. You can forgive their betrayals without forgetting what they're capable of. You can maintain family relationships while enforcing boundaries that protect your well-being. These contradictions aren't weaknesses. They're the reality of human relationships in all their messy, complicated glory. Sarah and I developed a new relationship, one built on transparency rather than assumed trust. She showed me her financial struggles openly now, asked for advice instead of stealing solutions. I helped where I could, offered guidance based on my own experience managing money through tight times, but I never gave her access to my accounts again. Some boundaries, once crossed, need to remain reinforced forever. Michael's journey was slower. Pride made it hard for him to accept that his mother had outmaneuvered him, that his elderly parent had proven more capable and strategic than he'd given her credit for. We talked occasionally, surface-level conversations about weather and work, but the depth we'd once shared was gone. Maybe it would return eventually. Maybe it wouldn't. I made peace with both possibilities. Jessica became my most consistent visitor, perhaps because her guilt drove her to prove she was different from her siblings, or perhaps because she genuinely understood what had almost been lost. She brought the grandchildren over regularly, helped with yard work and house repairs, called just to chat about nothing important. I accepted her presence without fully trusting her loyalty, another boundary lesson learned through painful experience. The physical scars from the stroke faded somewhat, though I'd always walk with a slight limp, and my left hand would never quite regain full strength. But I stopped seeing these as weaknesses and started viewing them as reminders. Reminders that I'd survived something that kills many people my age. Reminders that physical limitation doesn't equal mental incapacity. Reminders that visible vulnerability can blind people to inner strength, and sometimes you can use that blindness to your advantage. My friends rallied around me in ways I hadn't expected. Dorothy organized a weekly coffee group with other women our age, and we'd share stories about dealing with adult children and maintaining independence despite aging bodies. Some of their stories made mine seem mild by comparison. Adult children who stole medications to sell, families who placed parents in facilities and never visited, financial abuse so systematic and clever it took years to uncover. We weren't just a social group. We were survivors supporting each other through a challenged society rarely acknowledged. The betrayal of elderly parents by the children they'd devoted their lives to raising. One woman in our group, Helen, had completely cut off contact with her son after discovering he'd forged her signature on a reverse mortgage. She'd lost her home of 40 years before realizing what had happened. Her story made me grateful I'd caught Sarah's theft when I did, before it escalated to that level of destruction. It also made me realize how common elder financial abuse was. How many families were silently dealing with betrayals they were too ashamed to discuss publicly. We started talking about starting a support group, something formal that could connect isolated elderly people with resources and legal advice. The idea excited me in a way I hadn't felt since before the stroke. Having a purpose beyond my own recovery, using my experience to help others, transformed my pain into something meaningful. We partnered with the hospital where I volunteered and started monthly meetings. The turnout shocked everyone. Clearly, this was a need nobody was addressing. My nephew David helped us set up legal information sessions, teaching elderly people how to protect themselves from financial exploitation by family members. We covered topics like power of attorney documents, what they meant and when to use them, how to maintain control over medical decisions, even when delegating some authority, and warning signs that family members might be positioning themselves to take advantage. The gratitude from attendees was overwhelming and heartbreaking. So many of them had no idea they had rights, that saying no to adult children was allowed. Through all of this, I kept recovering, kept pushing myself to regain as much function as possible. My doctor called me his miracle patient, said my determination was unlike anything he'd seen in decades of practice. But I knew the truth. It wasn't determination for its own sake. It was spite, healthy spite, that refused to let my children's low expectations define my capabilities. Every physical milestone I reached, every task I relearned, every accommodation I mastered was a quiet middle finger to everyone who'd written me off as a burden. 18 months after the stroke, I could walk 2 miles without stopping, cook full meals without assistance, manage my own shopping and cleaning, and live completely independently. I'd also rebuilt a social life that didn't depend on my children, developed hobbies I'd neglected during the busy years of child rearing and working, and created a financial plan that would sustain me well into my 90s if I lived that long. The house stayed mine, my savings stayed mine, and my decisions stayed mine. The relationship with my children remained complicated, probably always would be. We'd never returned to the innocent trust of earlier years, but we'd found a new equilibrium based on honesty and boundaries. They no longer treated me like a burden, possibly because I'd proven I wouldn't tolerate it, possibly because they'd learned some lessons from nearly losing me entirely, probably a combination of both. What surprised me most was discovering that independence in my 70s looked different than independence in my younger years, but it was no less valuable. I needed more help with some things, adaptations for others, and I'd learned that accepting appropriate help wasn't the same as surrendering control. The difference was consent and respect. When people offered help that empowered rather than infantilized, I accepted it gracefully. When they tried to take over under the guise of helping, I shut it down firmly. The grandchildren grew older, became more aware of family dynamics they'd been too young to understand during the crisis. Tyler, now 18 and preparing for college, wrote his application essay about watching his grandmother fight for her autonomy and what it taught him about strength and aging. He showed it to me before submitting, and I cried reading his words. He'd understood the lessons I'd hoped to teach, seen past the messy family drama to the core truth that dignity and respect don't have age limits. My younger grandchildren started asking questions about what had happened, why relationships with their parents seemed strained sometimes, why I was so careful about certain things. I answered honestly but age-appropriately, teaching them that love doesn't mean blind trust, that family members can make serious mistakes, and that forgiveness is a process rather than a single decision. I wanted them to grow up understanding healthy boundaries, rather than learning them through painful betrayal like I had. The support group continued to grow, expanding beyond our small hospital meetings to multiple locations across the region. We created resource packets, established partnerships with legal aid organizations, and started a buddy system pairing newly vulnerable elderly people with those who'd successfully navigated similar challenges. My story became part of the orientation materials, an example of what fighting back could look like. I never expected to become an advocate for elder rights in my 70s, but life rarely follows expected paths. Some days were still hard. Grief for the family relationships I'd thought I had, for the children I'd believed I'd raised to be better than they'd proven themselves, for the trust that had been destroyed and might never fully rebuild. But grief coexisted with empowerment now, with pride in how I'd handled an impossible situation, with satisfaction in knowing I'd protected myself when it mattered most. The second anniversary of my stroke arrived quietly. No dramatic celebration, just a regular Tuesday that happened to mark 2 years since my life changed completely. I made coffee in my kitchen, walked to my mailbox without a cane, paid my bills from my fully protected bank account, and reflected on everything those 2 years had contained. The betrayal, the discovery, the confrontation, the recovery, the rebuilding. Each phase had required different kinds of strength, different strategies, different versions of myself. I'd started those 2 years as someone who trusted easily, who believed family loyalty was unshakable, who'd never imagined her own children could view her as a burden to be managed rather than a person to be respected. I'd ended those 2 years as someone wiser, more cautious, more strategic, but not broken. They'd tried to break me, whether they'd admit it or not. They'd failed. In the end, I learned that respect isn't demanded. It's earned, but more importantly, it's also protected. You teach people how to treat you through what you tolerate, and the moment I stopped tolerating being called a burden, everything changed. My illness didn't make me weak. It revealed who around me was truly strong enough to handle difficulty with grace and who would crumble into selfish desperation. The comeback that shocked my whole family wasn't about revenge or punishment. It was about reclaiming myself, proving that aging doesn't equal obsolescence, that needing help doesn't equal helplessness, and that being someone's mother doesn't require accepting their betrayal. I came back as myself, fully and unapologetically, and that was the most shocking thing I could have done. Have you ever felt invisible in your own family? Like your voice stopped mattering the moment you showed vulnerability?